So welcome to everybody. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about some of the ideas on how you would unpack standards and curriculum and all of those kind of things. But before we get into that, let me switch over here hopefully to my Moodle account. Hopefully it hadn't logged me out. And let's just kind of walk through some of the assignments just in case you guys have questions. Okay, so we are in week 2, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see. Actually, before I do that, let me change my view to student view because y'all don't want to see all this other stuff that we see on Moodle. Okay, all right, so let me try it again. We're going to share. Okay, can you guys see Moodle now? My Moodle screen, if you would just give me a thumbs up. Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I do apologize. Several of you had emailed me about the reflective essay, and I kept trying to tell you here, it's there, blah, blah, blah. Unbeknownst to me, there was a major technical glitch that I could only have seen had I been in the student mode as opposed to instructor mode in Moodle. So once I finally figured that out, we were able to get it corrected. So for this week, we're really going to talk about some of the elements around mission and philosophy and all those kind of things. But let's look specifically at your assignments. So you have some reading and video assignments. That should not be any surprise. The videos are embedded here for you. And then you've got some additional links with some information on unpacking standards and things like that. So let me see if it'll let me go back. Okay. So make sure that's where you start with that. Then you've got the reflective essay that is this week. And you can see here, it's pretty simple. So based on what you've read, there's 3 questions to answer. And make sure that you justify your answer, provide specific examples, etc. That you have in-text references where appropriate and a reference list. Okay, so that's going to be due Sunday evening by 11:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Now, your other big assignment is not actually due till November the 17th, and hopefully this will make a lot more sense to you after we kind of walk through things tonight. But let's look at the, that is if it'll open for me. Okay, I'm gonna have to change my screen, sorry. Let's see, so I'm gonna stop sharing. Let me see if I can share the right one for you guys. Where is it? It's not showing, it's not showing. Oh, fudge. Okay, hang on. Let me try this one more time. Maybe if I move my little Word document over here, it'll let me share it now. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so your assignment is you are going to choose a standard, okay? So ideally it's going to be some kind of a content standard. So for example, students will be able to identify and inferences within a story at 100% accuracy. That may be a standard. Okay, so you're going to actually write out the standard for me or copy and paste it. It can be from your state. It can be from your school's curriculum or your district's curriculum. It can be Common Core. You choose the standard. Now, ideally, what I would encourage you to do is to make sure that you're choosing a standard that actually applies to your real life, because this may be something you want to use and duplicate on in the future. So if I'm a 9th grade algebra teacher, I'm going to choose a 9th grade algebra standard. If I teach 3rd grade social studies, I'm going to choose a 3rd grade social studies standard. You don't have to, but it just makes sense to do that as opposed to, some esoteric thing that you're never going to use in your life. Okay? Then from there, you're going to break down that standard. And the way that you're going to break down that standard is by listing first the nouns. So let me do a quick Google search here for you guys, and let's see if I can find, let's see, we'll do Louisiana, not the Louisiana State Fair. That would be fun to be at, but student standing. So I can show you how this actually works. I'm gonna get on Louisiana Believes real quick. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. And let's see, don't want any of that. Academic standards, sorry. And I'm just gonna pick one for, here, let me go ahead and share again so you guys can see.
Somebody mute Tracy. Somebody's making a lot of background noise.
Oh, okay, let me see if I can figure out who it is. Okay, yeah, I think we're good now. Is that better? Thumbs up? Okay, thank you. All right, so let's look at the math. So I'm gonna choose one from grade 6. Yeah, we don't need all that. What we need is actually a standard. So let's find a standard. Okay, so let's look at ratios and proportional relationships. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy and paste this standard. So my standard can be as simple as that. However, I would really encourage you to go a little bit further, and so where it says A, understand ratio concepts and use reasoning to solve problems, I'm going to do that all the way through number 2, okay? Or maybe let's just do number 1, make it simpler. So I'm going to copy that. Now, let me go back to my little page here. Sorry. I don't want to do that. Hang on, sorry. So let me try to scan share, see if I can get to come up. There it is. Okay. So on my sheet, I am just going to paste. Oh, good grief. Okay, well, don't do that exactly, but you get kind of the general idea here. So I'm going to put my standard in there. Okay. So I'm going to take some of this out just because it's ugly and messy. Okay. So there's my content standard. I'm going to go through and I'm going to identify my, let me see if this helps any. No. Identify my nouns. So for example, I need one of the nouns is going to be ratio. Another one's going to be problems. And actually I'm going to take out the example just because it's really messy here. It's hard to read. Okay. So I'm just going to list those here. Ratio, and problems. Okay, any other nouns I missed? Technically concepts. Okay, then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to list my verbs. So what are my verbs? Well, I need to understand and I need to use. Okay, so if this is my standard, I have to decide what level of Bloom's taxonomy, not taxology, taxonomy, I was teaching students about taxes this morning, sorry, does it fall under? So if I look specifically at my verbs, if I'm just asking a student to understand something, is that knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, or evaluation? What do you think? Somebody unmute and weigh in.
I think comprehension.
Okay. Could be. So let's put understand there. Okay. What about use?
Application.
Definitely application. Okay. So now I know that this standard is taught at a fairly low level on Bloom's taxonomy. The real question, which we'll get into further on in this course, is how is this standard tested? Okay, but let's assume that, you know what, I've looked at the test, we've done some alignment, and it really is at that comprehensive application level. So what is an objective that I would want for this student to be able to do? Well, unfortunately, too often, people just list as their learning objective the standard. But when we break apart or unpack a standard, every bit of punctuation matters. So if you think from a purely English sort of sentence diagramming perspective, so I need students to understand ratio concepts. That's the first part of this. If students don't have that understanding, they can't do that. The second part of this standard is that they now have to not only understand these concepts, they have to actually use ratio reasoning to solve problems. Now, this is probably not a standard. It sounds pretty simple on the surface, but it's probably going to take me at least 1 to 3, maybe even 5 days, depending on how well my students are doing, to teach this concept. So I'm going to start with the first part, which is understand ratio concepts. So what is my learning objective? It's going to be something like students will be able to, so you can just use that little acronym if you want. Sorry, I cannot type tonight because I can't see. Students will be able to define ratio. I'm not a math teacher, so y'all are going to have to bear with me here. Define ratios in context with whole numbers. That may be what I'm going to start with. So students will be able to define ratios in context with whole numbers at 90% accuracy. Okay? Pretty simple. We all write objectives all the time. So my question then I have to look at is, does this align with my standard? Am I teaching at the right level of Bloom's taxonomy? Probably not in this case, because defining something is simply at the knowledge level. I need my students to be able to use it at the comprehension level. So I might have to come back here and change my objective or strengthen my verb. So I can take out define and I could say understand ratios in context, let's say using whole numbers at 90% accuracy. So you see why this breaking down becomes important? Because if I just write my objective and I'm not looking at this from an alignment perspective, I'm not going to teach this at the rigor level needed for students to be successful. Then the next part of this is, how do you know when they know it? Okay? So maybe you're going to do, students will be able to complete 5 ratio problems with whole numbers. How are you going to assess this? Okay? So that's what you're going to do on that particular part of this assignment. Now let me get back to Moodle here. Where is it? There we go. So that's part 1.
Tracy.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell me if this sounds similar. Being a SPED teacher, this sounds a lot like how I do my goals for IEPs.
Uh-huh.
Same concept?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, finally, regular ed caught up to what special ed's been doing for, many, many years.
Yeah.
And realized that if we did this for all students, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. I had an IEP initial this morning too, so.
Yeah, so you've actually got 2 different templates that you're going to be using. Okay, so this is the second one. Same kind of idea. Actually, you don't have to do both. That's ridiculous. You can do just one of them. So this is the other option if you like this template better. A lot of schools do the big idea, essential questions, and things like that. I personally like this one better because I do believe that I have to really know what my concepts are. I have to know what the big idea is. So what is it that I want students to know long term? And then what is the essential question? So, maybe it's something like, why do I need to know about ratios and proportion? Why is that important in life? That may be your essential question, okay? So pick a template from this. Sorry, I gotta keep my screens here going the right way, sorry. Too much clicking. Okay, so you can choose either the first template or the second template to do, and here is, again, let me share. Can y'all see this one? Where's my little zoomy thing here? Okay, so this is a third template. Okay, so you can use any one of those 3. I don't care which one you choose. Just choose the one that you think is the most helpful and useful to you. Okay? Make sense? So you have 3 different templates from very simple to a little bit more complex. And if you're, or here's the third option, choose one of those 3, or if you already have a template that you use in your school to unpack standards or something like that, you're welcome to use that as well, okay? And this isn't due until the 17th. So you've got a little bit of time on it. It's not hard once you kind of understand it, but if you've never done unpacking a standard, then it can be a little bit, I wouldn't say confusing, but it may just be, you know, like, okay, what does she mean? And if you're not an English person and you're like, noun, verb, whatever, just kind of pick out the concepts and then the do part. What do you want them to do and what do you want them to know, okay? Questions, concerns, comments about that? Okay, awesome. Then let me put this down here. And
I'm sorry, Miss Christie. I have one.
Yeah,
So
go
it's
ahead.
only for one standard, right?
You're only going to choose, yes, 1 standard.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I used to make everybody do 6, and then I just decided that was just really kind of overkill. So yeah, y'all don't talk to my students who took this course a while ago. You only have to do 1. Just do it well. Okay, so let's talk about understanding by design. How many of you guys have ever heard of Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe? Ooh, nobody, huh? Okay. You know, on the list of researchers that you probably want to know about and follow their work, Wiggins and McTighe are top on the list. Okay, there's a few others, but these are like the go-to gurus of curriculum. Okay, so in this course, we're talking about leading instruction and assessment. And one of the key elements of leading instruction and assessment is understanding the interdependent relationships that exist between curriculum, instruction, and assessment. These are the go-to guys for curriculum. The other names that you're going to want to know is Fenwick English and Heidi Hayes Jacobs. They are by far the best curriculum minds out there. So Wiggins and McTighe.
Who did you say before Heidi?
Fenwick English. Okay. And all of their ideas are very simple, or very similar, excuse me. So like when on one of those templates where it talked about the essential question, that's from Heidi Hayes Jacobs. And I believe she's one of your videos this week. And then Fenwick English, his is pretty simple. He does what is the intended curriculum? What is the taught curriculum? What's the assessed or tested curriculum? So it's that, like I said, their ideas are very similar. They just have slightly different approaches. So, you know, you don't have to be married to one. Quite frankly, I think pretty much everybody out there bastardizes all 3 together and kind of does it that way. But we're going to focus tonight on understanding by design. So let me pull this up and get it going so we can walk through it here. Okay, whoops, sorry. I always forget that I have to share first. So share. There we go. Okay, now let me start the slideshow. Okay, so as I said, Wiggins and McTighe, the original version of this book was published in 2002, which is kind of old for research, but they have actually done multiple updates to the book. And like I said, I would dare say if you were able to walk into the assistant superintendent or the chief academic officer of your school district, more than likely this book would be on their shelves. If it's not, then, you know, I'd be a little concerned. So let's talk about sort of the big ideas of understanding by design. So you may be familiar with the work of Stephen Covey, and in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about starting with the end in mind. Well, this is the same premise as related to curriculum. So what Wiggins and McTighe tell us to do is we want to start first with our desired results. So what is it that we want to happen? So maybe it is in your class, you want 95% of your students to score at the college readiness level on the state's math assessment, okay? So that's your desired result. How are you going to know if that actually occurs? So you have to also know what is going to be your acceptable evidence to prove that. Is it going to be a benchmark test that you do? Is it a mock test? Is it going to be looking at student work samples? You know, you can go a million different directions with this, but you have to know how you're going to measure or have assurances that your results have been met. Then you have to plan the learning experiences and instruction. So it's that idea of starting with the end in mind. How do I measure and assess it? And then how do I plan? Most people do just the opposite. They start with learning and instruction. They plan that first. Then they decide how they're going to assess it. Then they look at results. So a lot of times we'll get these unintended consequences when we plan the wrong way. And we may have great planning, we may have good evidence, but we don't get the results that we hoped for because we're doing it the wrong way. So the whole premise, the whole idea is start with the end in mind and work from there. So, as I said, the stages are very logical, but they go against our habits. You know, so especially if you've been teaching for a long time and like, you know, I'm a devotee of Madeline Hunter, which some of you probably never even heard of because that's really old school. But we were taught that you start first with the lesson and the activities, when in reality, you can't do that. You have to have performance goals for our students. So those templates that I just shared with you that I'm going to have you do to unpack a standard is part of clarifying those goals. So it's that whole idea of you start big and then you narrow it down and make it more specific. So we also have to be really aware of assessment. So if you've never looked at a release test or sample questions or something like that from some of your state or national assessments that your students have to take, you're really missing the boat. Because what happens is we may teach a standard and we may teach it really, really well, but it's not the same way it's tested on that assessment. So the three cannot exist without each other. So curriculum, instruction, and assessment absolutely depend on each other. So it embodies the 3 stages of backwards assign, and it's a pretty easy way to do this. Now, according to Wiggins and McTighe, this is usually done at the unit level. You don't necessarily want to do this for every single lesson that you do, but the template says that you have these overarching understandings, some essential questions, again, they borrowed that from Heidi Hayes, knowledge and skill to be acquired. So, what are the big ideas of each stage? So you will notice that we have here a standard. Then we have some understandings. This would be, what are the things we need our students to know? What are the concepts, etc.? What are those essential questions? So, you know, I need my students to know, blah, blah, blah. How am I going to assess it? And then what are my activities that I'm going to do? So notice again, it's that whole idea of unpacking first. What is it our kids need to know? How is it going to be assessed? And this other little block here can be used for how, you know, what's like a sample question or something like that from one of the release tests related to that. Then we get into planning the activities. Most people start at the bottom and go up, but that's incorrect. You start at the top and work down. Okay, so first thing you do, unpack the content standards. Focus on the big ideas. So it's that idea of learning at the conceptual level as opposed to at the specific or, you know, micro level. Okay. Then you have to look at multiple sources of evidence. Don't just assume that if you give a unit test, that's going to be sufficient. In an ideal world, assessment occurs every single day in class. It can be informal. It doesn't even have to be written, but we have to think about all the multiple ways that we can assess whether or not students are learning. And then finally, you're going to derive what is the implied learning or the activities that you have developed here in these two. Okay? So obviously, if we're going to talk about ratios and we're teaching that at the conceptual level, I'm going to do a series of quick checks. I'm going to look at student work samples. I'm going to give a quiz. I'm going to use a unit test. Well, clearly that is going to drive how I plan my learning. Okay. So again, just to reiterate, what are the big ideas? what's the evidence, and how will we get there? So for those of you that have taken the professional learning communities class with me, or you're going to in the future, those probably sound really familiar because those are the 3 big guiding questions that we use in a professional learning community. Also too, when you're doing a unit plan, it is best to do this collaboratively with other teachers, excuse me, because again, we want everybody to be aligned in what they're doing. Okay. So when you go in and look at this, you'll see that by stage, you have all of these different pieces, okay? So this is specifically, there's a, you can actually go in online and download the actual template that will fill all this in, but you can see in stage 1, we're looking for understandings, questions, we're looking at content standards, knowledge and skill. In the second part, we're looking at tasks and rubrics and evidence for assessment. And then in stage 3, we're doing that learning plan or activities, okay? So you can start with, and I'm not going to read all these to you, you can start with the content standards. You can look at all of these different places that you might want to start. I will tell you 90.9% of the time, you're probably going to start with a content standard. Because we know that everything is so content driven right now and standard driven, this makes the most sense. But there may be occasions that, you know what, you're like, you know what, that content standard, my students really didn't get the big idea out of that. They maybe can do the manipulation of formulas to come up with an answer, but they really don't know the concept. So I may start here. And when I'm thinking about, you know, where do I want to begin my planning, okay? We're not going to go through all this. Okay. Now, this is where Wiggins and Mtg and I kind of disagree. It says it doesn't matter where you start as long as the final design is coherent. I have seen very, very few teachers or groups of teachers who can do this out of order. The only few people I've known that can are people who design curriculum for a living. So, you know, I say start at the top and work down. Technically, Wiggins and Mtg say you can start anywhere, just make sure things are aligned. I disagree, but they are the experts. But I wouldn't advise it as you first get it. So if we think in terms of, hang on just one second, guys. I'm checking, I'm hearing some background noise. So if we think in terms of the big ideas, so, you know, maybe it's something like the parallel postulate. That's a big idea. Or SAS congruence, or, you know, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Those are all big concepts or big ideas we want students to learn. Like in our example, ratio, that's a big concept that we want students to learn. Lots of little elements within that. So again, a big idea is a system of many powerful inferences from a small set of givens, okay? It's like the rules to the game or like a Bill of Rights. So big ideas are typically core concepts, themes, debates, etc. And a principle, a theory. So, you know, if I'm in science, maybe I'm going to talk about the theory of relativity. So that is my organizing theory. That is the big idea that we need to work on. Okay. So in literacy, I'm sorry, it can be reading between the lines, inferencing. It can be persuasion. It can be fiction. It can be, like I said, a million different examples. Okay. So a lot of times teachers and others will struggle at first with the idea of what is a truly big idea. So these are some guiding questions that you can go through. For example, can it yield great depth and breadth of insight into the subject? So a big idea, like I said, in you know, mathematics is the order of operations. Huge idea. It's going to be used throughout their mathematics education. Very important critical concept. So that would definitely be a big idea that I want to make sure that I teach. I teach to depth and complexity, and that I reinforce frequently. Okay. So you've got to go below the surface. So I think many of us have seen the iceberg sort of analogy where this is all you see on top. So that may be the activities and stuff, but the real test of a great lesson that's going to create enduring and sustainable student learning occurs in the planning stage. Again, go back to Covey. Covey talks a lot about that you spend the majority of your time doing those things that are going to be most important and planning and pre-work and all that, only to spend a small amount of time in the visible kind of work. Because if you don't do the planning part well, then we know that there's going to be issues when it comes to the actual lesson, okay? So let's talk a little bit about acceptable evidence and identifying results. So I guess we're going to start with identifying results. Sorry about that. So again, we've talked a little bit about this. So what specific insights do we want students to leave with? So order of operations, that they understand that order and why it's important and how and when it's going to be applied. That's the big understanding or big idea. What is an essential question? So again, helping students to really pinpoint, and I always shared my essential questions. They were always on the board. That helps them to have really provocative and meaningful inquiry. Instead of just having them memorize the order, help them to figure out and discover, how it may change an answer or how it can be impactful. So you should be able to define, and this is where your learning objective comes from, what is it that students should know and what should they be able to do with that knowledge? And then what are your content standards? Because if you've done a good unpacking job, you started here with your standards, and then you're able to create the rest of these from that unpacking of that standard or standards, okay? So again, this just kind of reiterates that again. You'll need to unpack your standards so that you can really see what the big idea is. Some people can do it without that, but the vast majority of teachers really need to unpack first because, again, like I said, you can do it in any order, but it's rare that people can come up with a big idea without doing this first, okay? So, an understanding is the moral of the story. So what specific insights do you want students to take away from these big ideas? And then they have to be things that the students can summarize, they can internalize, and then they can actually reiterate back to you, okay? Sorry, there we go. Okay, so sometimes it may be specific. Sometimes it may be, like I said, a full sentence. Sometimes it may be to uncover something. So for example, if you want them to have a specific generalization about that big idea, they may summarize key meanings, inferences, and why this content's important. If you want them to really get what they call the moral of the story, students will need to understand that. So right there is the beginning of a great learning objective. If you are working with something that's maybe not quite as is brand new, a brand new idea or concept to the students, you may need to really help them with some of those inferences and things that are not explicitly talked about or taught within your lesson. Okay, so here's some examples. I'm not going to go through all these with you guys. You can read these at your leisure. Okay. Also, too, Wiggins and McTighe really make a distinction between knowledge and understanding. So, understanding is where we're able to make sense of information, usually facts or ideas. It in essence connects the dots. An understanding may be something that is more, you can't articulate it quite as well, but it's based in fact, and it's more that inferencing sort of thing. So for example, I used to tell, we had this process in our school with seniors that we had to do their final exams like 3-4 days before graduation, get all the grades in and certify students and all that kind of stuff. And so I would often tell the students, like, okay, you're going to work on your senior project since you finished your exams and, you don't have to be back here until this time. And they're all like, what? And I'm like, didn't we teach you to inference? Read between the lines. That would be an understanding that the students needed to have to realize that they just didn't need to be at school and not to be in our hair that kind of time. Essential questions are Questions that you can argue about, they're at the heart, they raise important conceptual or philosophical issues, but they're also a great organizing tool to really kind of put together connected learning. Okay, so again, you start out with what they call, let me go back here real quick, see if it will. Essential questions. I am so sorry, I don't know why this keeps doing this weird stuff tonight. It can be essential all the way through leading type questions. And again, this goes into some detail, okay? So here's some samples that you can look at to kind of get an idea of what is a good sample essential question. So let's talk about evidence now. So this is, what are those performance tasks that our students need to do? What is the other evidence? And rubrics, how are we going to assess complex performance as opposed to just giving a straight grade? Okay, so it should be credible and whenever possible, make it relevant. Okay, so oftentimes we just give kids these crazy math problems or these stories to read and they don't have any background or relevance at all. One of the things that you want to do in your planning and to make sure that carries into your teaching is the idea that we are going to have relevance. We're going to have rigor and things that are real for our kids. Okay, so it's actually an evidence of understanding. It's really hard to gauge if somebody understands something. It's much easier to gauge if they know the right answer. So, when you use the verb understanding, that's one of my least favorite verbs in standards because again, it's very hard for me to test or measure or to see. So we have to really focus on what is this? Does the student know why it works, why it matters, and how to use it? So that becomes a key way to assess understanding. Okay? Now, you really understand when you can go through Bloom's taxonomy and do all of these things. Okay? So another element to assessing and getting evidence about this. Okay? So when we want to do authentic tasks, this is a nice little graphic that kind of explains how you can do an authentic task as a form of assessment. So pretty simple to follow. Okay. We also want to make sure that our assessments are sound. Like I talked about earlier, that they really are aligned to not only our state standards, but how they're tested. And also, too, don't be naive enough to think that if you've taught a standard one time, the students have learned it. You have to make sure that there is continuing evidence over time that students have truly mastered a particular standard or concept. Okay? So we're not going to get a lot into reliability and sufficiency right now, but, make sure that when you're thinking about assessment that you really are varying it, that it's not always the same thing. Students ask me all the time, who are thinking about joining one of our graduate programs, what does the professor do? Well, because we have some really strong professors in our healthcare administration program, they do all of these. Because they understand the importance of varying what they do, because when you vary it, you not only increase the reliability of your results, most importantly, you know that you have sufficient evidence to demonstrate or to track mastery of concepts. Okay? So, local assessment is direct, state is indirect. Okay? So don't just mimic what the state does. Like I said, it goes back to what we just talked about. Multiple ways to assess. Okay? All right. Now let's talk about experiences and instruction. Okay? So the whole idea is that we want to have the most effective and engaging instruction we possibly can. Not just effective, not just engaging, but the two have to be married together. Okay? So, you have to design learning experiences that's going to create the conditions for students to master whatever the standard is asking them to do. So, for example, you may want to break down your lesson and think about designing instruction around these, around the acronym WHERE to. Okay, so where are we headed? What is it I want them to know? That's the student's question. How are you going to hook your student? What opportunities are going to be there to experience or explore? What about opportunities to rethink, refine, revise? How are students going to evaluate their own work? And how are they going to tailor this so that, you've got some students who are visual learners, some that are auditory learners. You've got some students who need to work in a small group, or you may have some students that need to work individually. You have to really think about that and figure out ways to meet the needs of, a myriad of students. Okay. So the whole idea behind this is that you put one idea in at a time, because you want to make sure that when you do this, that you're not creating such a complexity of planning that you really kind of lose the aim of where you're going. Okay. So there's their contact information. That I don't know if that's actually still their email addresses or not. Maybe it is. So let me stop the sharing. Okay, so kind of get understanding by design. Start with the end in mind, plan for evidence, and then move into curriculum instruction and creating lesson plans. But the whole idea is this is unit planning done preferably in a collaborative situation with other teachers teaching similar or the same content. Okay. What questions or comments or concerns or observations? Anything we need to share before we finish out for the evening?
I have a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Our district has gone through 3 new ELA curriculums in the past, like one every year.
Oh.
Being Title I district, how does that pull into play? Because, I mean, they have to have certain factors, I'm assuming, to be Title I. So
yeah. All a Title I district means is that the vast majority of your students qualify for free or reduced lunch. So you have a very high, low socioeconomic index. When you're in a situation where there are constant curricular changes, that's when I say always push back to the standards. So, it kind of comes down to there's sort of this debate about how do you define curriculum. Some people say curriculum is nothing more than a listing of standards and maybe some support mechanisms to help you teach that. Other people say curriculum is scripted to the point of on Monday, November the 4th, you're going to teach this. Here's the questions you're going to ask. Here's your learning activities. Ideally, curriculum is going to be something that is a guiding factor. So I know as a principal, we often questioned, particularly my last high school principalship, we really questioned if the district's curriculum was any good. I mean, we were a little bit arrogant, I guess, as a group, but, we just could not get quite the results we wanted. And we were being very diligent in following the curriculum. And so, I'm meeting with my leadership team, and we're really kind of struggling with this question of why are we not getting the results we want? Is it assessment? Is it instruction? Is it the curriculum? And I knew the instruction was good. The assessment was there, so we finally decided it was curriculum. And I'll never forget, my department chair said, let us throw out the curriculum. Let us do what we know needs to be done. And I'm like, I'm freaking out because, as a principal, if my school goes low performing or whatever, that's the end of me. But at the same time, I knew these people knew what they were doing. And so we kind of threw out the curriculum, and we pulled elements that made sense. We tried to stick to the timeline that we were given, but we simply got in there and really learned and unpacked and got messy with the standards. A lot of teachers, or a lot of curriculum too, will also give you an unpacked standard. Don't fall for it. Teachers have to unpack it to understand it and internalize it and teach it. Like I said, canned curriculums, just like canned programs, rarely work. But when we did that, our results, we threw out the curriculum, the teachers kind of redid everything. It was very intense. It took a lot of time. But our results went through the roof. And we just started this trajectory of amazing achievement. So much so that all my poor department chairs had to end up being on the curriculum writing committee for the district, because they're like, whatever y'all did made sense. So like I said, when there's a lot of change happening in curriculum, always fall back on the standards. That's your constant. And as long as you're teaching that to depth and complexity, that's a huge part. It's aligned with your assessments, and you're seeing quality delivery of instruction, you'll be fine. Other questions? I'm trying to read over here on the side. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're not reading the chats, yeah, I hate scripted curriculum. I was offered a really great job in another district where part of my job would be to oversee curriculum and instruction, but they use scripted curriculum. I'm like, I'm not your person, because I'm not going to give anybody a script. You know, for one thing, it's rare that the students in the same building with teacher A and teacher B have the same needs, let alone outside of that school, let alone across the system. Every class is unique and different, and that's why we hire teachers to go in there and do that. We don't just have robots, you know, presenting lessons kind of thing. Okay. Other questions or comments? Well, y'all are letting me off easy tonight. So we'll see each other. I guess we'll see each other next week. You've got a reflective essay due. You know, this coming Sunday, and then the following week you'll have your unpacking standards thing. And I will tell you, do not freak out about the unpacking standards. Choose one of 3 templates, do one standard, or you can use your own template if you have one, and don't make it more complex than it needs to be. I have some people in the past who've really freaked out about this. I am not, like I said, I just want you to get comfortable with the idea. Okay, you know, it's not rocket science, but, you know, just kind of get in there and mess with it. And if you're unsure, email it to me before you submit it, and I will give you some feedback and stuff, and we can kind of massage it until you're ready to submit. Because, you know, like I said, this for me is not so much about giving grades or, you know, people not being successful. I just want you guys to experience this stuff. So when you're in that leadership role and, you know, you need to do some work with your teachers, you have some tools that you can use and access. Okay. All right. Going once, going twice. We all have a great week, and we will see you next time. Then turn off the recording.